Well, thanks very much, John, and thank you for colleagues at Solent University for inviting me to speak here. I kind of feel like the whole thing's a terrible setup, actually. I was invited to deliver a speech about the problems that Southampton's got, and then I sit there for half an hour listening to the fact that Southampton is the new Barcelona, ripping up bits of my speech. I've only got really 4 sentences left, actually, so I'm a great admirer of John Denham's as well, and I'm a great admirer actually of any politician who's successful. I'm a failed politician, and I can always remember the moment when I realised it was never going to work out for me. I was a county councillor, as John said, in Warwickshire, and I remember going to a meeting in Stratford-upon-Avon. The Labour Party was trying to get rid of the 11 plus in Warwickshire. It was never going to happen, but it was in our manifesto, and this was at a time when the Labour Party was a great one for kind of futile gestures. So we were at this public meeting. There were hundreds of enraged Stratford-upon-Avon parents, and right at the end, one of them came up to me and stopped me and said, he said, what do you think you're wearing? Because I wasn't wearing a tie. I don't normally wear ties. I wasn't even wearing a suit. I was just wearing a jacket. And I said, well, he said, it's absolutely disgraceful. And I said to him, well, I said, look, I'm just wearing, I'm just wearing ordinary clothes. I'm an ordinary person. He looked at me right in the eye and he said, yes, he said, I'm rather afraid you are. I knew then that I had no future as a public figure. As John said, I started my political career, such as it was here, and still, 35 years later, however long it is, the most nerve-wracking political activity I've ever undertaken was leafleting against the Falklands War in Bargate a few days after the task force had set sail. I don't know how I survived that, really. That was back in the early 80s when the Labour Party shared the description that Shelley once applied to his dying grandmother, that she had lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the power of speech. Now things actually were never that bad in Southampton, but at the risk of them being denounced as national traitors by the Daily Mail, I can reveal that John, and particularly Alan Whitehead, were keen fans of the early 20th century Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci said many important things. In fact, Michael Gove is very fond of quoting his views on education, but the most memorable thing he ever said, the most memorable quote really ascribed to him, was that he urged revolutionaries in the face of the many defeats of the left. He urged them to follow the practice of, and I quote, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Now, by the way, I should just take this opportunity, I don't think Alan Whitehead's here, but I should take this opportunity to apologise to Alan, because I have for many years, entirely erroneously, I just made this up, but I've dined out on it, told people that once, when he was leader of the council, Alan urged a similar attitude of empirical resignation and blind hope on a resident wanting to know when a pothole in his street might be repaired. Anyway, you'll be relieved to hear there is some purpose to all this kind of meandering nostalgia, because in a way I'm adapting Gramsci as the coda for my speech. I'm going to urge in my comments realism of the intellect and optimism of the will. The question I want to suggest for Southampton is simply this: can the whole of this city be greater than the sum of its many impressive parts? And I want to argue that it's not a question that can be answered in principle or in abstract, but only concretely and through action. A few weeks ago I embarked on what I thought was going to be a speech of objective analysis about urban trends and challenges for urban policy, but in the end, with humility but with enthusiasm, I'm an outsider, I have written a call to arms, and I want to explain the thought process that's taken me on that journey. So I was a political strategist. I used to advise on I was in charge, by the way, for Tony Blair in his third term of ensuring that Tony Blair remained popular in the Labour Party and the country. So you can see I've got an impressive CV. If you're developing political narratives, there are really 3 ways in which you can try to persuade public opinion that something's important or urgent or requires action. The first way you do this, the first narrative, is the narrative of crisis. This is the most common. If something isn't done, we are doomed. We hear this a moment about social care. We hear it in the longer term about the global climate. The second framing is big choice. This is the essence of most policy debates you'll hear on the Today programme, which both sides talk up the dire consequences of not getting their way. And the third is window of opportunity. And here the sense of urgency lies in the idea that something great could happen, but only if we grab it with both hands. We heard a lot of that around the Olympic legacy, for example. So I thought about those narratives in relation to Southampton. And try as I might, and believe me I did, because as a person on the left, I am prone to being miserable. It was beyond me to argue that Southampton is facing a unique crisis, or to put it more precisely, that Southampton is facing a unique crisis that requires an answer that only Southampton alone can provide. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't things we should worry about. If the worst predictions about climate change are true, this university might have to change its name to Southampton Solent University. As the place where the Black Death first arrived in Britain in the 14th century, and thank you for that, it could be that if there is a global pandemic, the people of Southampton will be the first to go. But there's not a great deal when it comes to these kinds of global challenges that Southampton can do on its own, apart from having good public health and sustainability strategies and encouraging national and international leaders to act sensibly. Reflecting for this speech, I considered whether we needed a new motto for this. It's not quite clear whether there is a motto for Southampton. There are lots of different mottos for Southampton. And I thought, I quite like the idea of catch the tide. I thought it was a good kind of maritime. But, as one of the residents said in that wonderful video, actually, I'm almost quoting him, if you were really to reflect the combination of moderate pride and diffidence that one hears from Southampton folk, the motto of this city would surely be, Southampton, it's really not too bad. And the facts, you see, the problem is that the facts confirm the impression. Southampton has relatively low unemployment. Yes, the wages of people living in the city are below the average for the country and the region, but that's largely because every weekday evening many higher earners drive their salaries out of town. Southampton suffers from a hollowing out of the labour market, growth in high-skilled jobs in education, professions, engineering, and in low-paid, low-skilled work in the service sector. In between, there are too few medium-skilled jobs with prospects that pay decent wages. But although that's an issue that deserves attention and is getting attention, it's also a national, indeed it's an international phenomenon. A few years ago, if I was making this speech 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said there were severe grounds for warning of an impending crisis in school education. But it's important to note that impressive work in Southampton schools has largely closed the attainment gap with places that have a similar social mix. Having said which, there are absolutely no grounds for complacency. There are particular problems in Southampton, a very high exclusion rate in schools, for example, and it did take the city far too long to recognise it had a problem in the first place, and cohorts of pupils suffered as a consequence. The important thing to remember about schools is that even if Southampton is improving, everywhere in the world is investing in education and sees education as its future. And so if you are standing still, you are falling behind. Southampton too has a number of deprived areas, particularly in comparison to the rest of the wider region. And this city, like so many other places, have seen the 3 or 4 decades after the Second World War of rising social mobility and falling poverty levels be reversed. But in a sense, the issue in Southampton is less the sheer scale of deprivation, nor the sense that its poorer areas are about to collapse, but the question of how such poverty and poor life chances can persist in a city and a region that is otherwise doing pretty well. And what about the social composition of the city? Like other places, Southampton has benefited enormously over the last few decades from becoming more ethnically and nationally diverse. It's more mixed than the surrounding country, less than many other UK cities. Mass immigration has not caused a backlash in the form of extreme right activity or intercommunal violence, but there's a simmering discontent and resentment underlying the upsurge in support for UKIP. People want to know, here in Southampton and everywhere, that those who join a local population are making a contribution. But this begs the question, a contribution to what? Most immigrants are keen to show they're full members of their new community, but apart from obeying the law and paying their taxes, what is the shared project that we want Southampton's incomers to show that they sign up to? Now, one of the most often cited 21st century quotations is Rahm Emanuel's injunction that he issued after the credit crunch, never to let a serious crisis go to waste. And so my conclusion on this point is that although there are many things that can and should get better in Southampton, there is no obvious pending crisis that you can rely on to precipitate action. The city will have to find the motivation to change somewhere in itself. So what about the second narrative, the fork in the road? Is there a vital make or break strategic choice facing this city? Of course, the recession hit Southampton. The loss of Ford was a big blow, but the city weathered the downturn better than most. And now the components of economic development seem reasonably clear. As we've heard from Jan Ward and Barbara Compton, it can be seen in the economic development strategy of Solent LEP. It can be seen in the fact that Portsmouth and Southampton, despite their intense local rivalries, do recognise that they share interest in the development of this broader region. The focus on advanced marine-related manufacturing, the attempt to develop and support the SME sector, what you've heard about the development of the city centre, its cultural quarter, the engagement of both universities in important aspects of economic development. Now, I'm not in a position to say whether all this work is of the highest calibre, looked pretty impressive this morning, or more or less likely to succeed than other economic development strategies, but it all seems eminently sensible. It's difficult, or difficult for me at least, to see something which should be approached radically differently. Indeed, while national government remains ambivalent about industrial strategy, here, as in other city regions, public and private sector partners are working really effectively together on a shared set of economic priorities. Now, big choices are often expressed in terms of infrastructure. Think of London's fourth airport, HS2. Those are big choice narratives. And this city would benefit from faster train journey times, better links to the M27, other projects. But also, there is a record of successful infrastructural development, stretching back to the container terminal in the 60s, the development of the motorway M27 in the 70s, the growth of the airport with twice as many passengers now as a decade ago, right up to the opening 2 years ago of the Southampton-Nuneaton freight line. So the point I'm making here is this, that the city's infrastructure and links may not be perfect. There's always a case for more investment. But it's difficult to imagine this city is going to overnight stop being what it is, which is a pretty well-connected place. And that returns me to my point earlier about realism of the intellect. There's always a tendency in these kinds of contexts to talk about the idea that cities can go up and down at the flick of a switch. There'll be policies to be made in the next 12 months that will have a massive impact. Of course, policy matters, but the reality of cities, when you look at them all around the world, things change slightly more gradually than that. Cities don't generally move up or down a great deal in the national pecking order, for example. In every European country, the biggest city a century ago remains the biggest city today. That's because size, location, connectivity, characteristics that are relatively fixed, are critical factors to city success. And when city fortunes do change, and city fortunes do of course, it tends actually to be a result of external shifts. Changes in technology, global patterns of production can cause great damage to cities dependent on a single sector. In Monday, I'm making a speech in Wales. In Wales before the Second World War, more than half the people were dependent on mining, for example. Conversely, new technologies can lay the basis for fast expansion. To quote an American urban economist, Phoenix, Las Vegas and Houston probably wouldn't have attained their current size without the invention of air conditioning. But looking at Southampton, the sectors that are strengths, maritime, transport, higher education, retail, they look like they're set fair. And there are reasons to be optimistic about other growth areas, media, culture, tourism. So in terms of my second narrative, big choice, there are choices to be made. There are aspects of the future that are unpredictable, but it feels to me as an outsider that these are questions less about which route to take at a crossroads and more about which of a variety of crossing paths to take in a broadly agreed direction. And so I found myself left with one narrative, the idea of missed opportunity. And fortunately, this is where I think we have something to go on. Because despite the quality of so much that happens in this city, from Premiership football and test matches to the boat show, from world-class university research to excellence in marine engineering, this is, as we saw, a city that rarely sets itself the aspiration of being the very best, as we saw from local residents. In short, Southampton is a place that finds it hard to get too excited about itself. If Brighton looked in the mirror, I think it would wink cheekily at itself. If Bristol looked at itself in the mirror, I think it would do a zany song and dance. If Portsmouth even looked in the mirror, I think it would flex its muscles and bare its teeth. If Southampton looked in the mirror, I suspect it might simply shrug. Now, perhaps this doesn't matter. You know, we live in a PR-soaked world. In such a world, modesty is hardly a quality in oversupply, but I think it does. And to explain why, I'm going very briefly to offer a diagnosis of society, a theory of change, an example of failure and an example of success. Now the diagnosis of society is this, and it's the RSA's. It's that the problem with solving complex social problems and achieving progress is not so much about agreeing what we want. In fact, on the whole, the British people, moderate, realistic, we share a definition of the good society in which we want to live. The problem is not really that we have radically different accounts of the kind of place we want to live in. The problem is that we're not currently thinking and acting in the ways in which we need to think and act to create the future that we say we want. There is a gap between our hopes and our current trajectories. We at the RSA, we use a rather ugly phrase. I coined this phrase, the social aspiration gap. I was a sociologist. I got my degree in sociology, and we talk like this. I'm sure you've heard the old joke, what do you get when you cross a sociologist, a member of the mafia? And the answer is someone who makes you an offer you can't understand. So we at the RSA say that we need to enable people to be the people they need to be to create the future they say they want. That's our diagnosis. And here's my theory. It's an incredibly simple theory. Ultimately, there are three sets of reasons why people do stuff. They do it because they want to. It's in their perceived self-interest. They do it because it's what the group they're part of expects or needs, or they do it because they're told to by some form of authority. If we want change to happen, particularly when it's change in complex areas, we need to think about how we combine wise authority and hierarchy, shared values and social responsibility, and aspiration and self-interest. And although that's such a simple idea, it is amazing how rarely proposals for change meet those basic criteria. So, to exemplify this point, here's a tragedy and a triumph. The tragedy is this. In 1999, I was incredibly proud when Tony Blair announced a commitment to end child poverty. What a wonderful goal. And actually Labour made very significant progress towards that goal. But now it's been effectively abandoned and nobody really seems to care very much. My view is that's because when Blair made this pledge and the later messaging that went through it implied that this transformation, this unbelievable change in our country could come about primarily by just spending loads of money and by a bunch of clever people in the Treasury inventing new taxes, a new tax and benefit system. In other words, the promise to Britain was that this amazing thing could be done simply relying on those in authority. Where was the story of the role of the public, much less those in poverty themselves? Looking back, hindsight being a wonderful thing, this is what Blair should have said. I used to be Tony Blair's speechwriter, but he never used anything I ever wrote. So this is what he should have said if I'd managed to get Andrew Adonis to suggest that he said it. I think he should have said, I have a dream that we as a nation can end child poverty. He should have said, for my own part, I'm willing to make this a priority for government, get other parties signed up, but we need a crusade by society as a whole, businesses, taxpayers, churches, community groups, and most of all, those in poverty themselves who will share their aspirations and grasp the opportunities we'll provide. So a visionary ideal that Labour had failed to embed itself in our hearts and our minds because there was no story of public engagement, no story of public agency. So contrast that with the more modest ambitions of Mick Cornett, the Republican mayor of Oklahoma. On New Year's Eve in 2007, after unsuccessfully dieting for years, he called a press conference in front of the elephant cage in the city zoo. He told the assembled journalists he'd been trying to lose weight, he had failed, and that he decided the only thing he could do to succeed was to get the whole of the city to help him. He challenged his fellow citizens in one of the US's most overweight cities, and they really do overweight properly in the US, to lose £1 million in weight. Over the coming months, more than 50,000 overweight citizens signed up to his campaign, competing with each other to lose the most weight. And it was only after putting himself out there and engaging the public that he did, in time, start to do more conventional things that local governments do. In mid-2009, he began polling citizens for thoughts on how to redesign their city. And his newly active public now supported making Oklahoma more exercise-friendly. The mayor drew up a plan, and in December 2009, with the weight loss tally nearly £500,000, he held a referendum that overwhelmingly improved a 1 cent sales tax with a target of raising $750 million. That money was earmarked for a 70-acre city centre park, hundreds of miles of improved sidewalks, hiking and biking trails. And then, Businesses wanted to jump on the bandwagon, providing another $140 million in loans to be paid back through tax revenue and property taxes to make the streets more pedestrian friendly, add bike lanes, public art, or revamp botanical gardens, etc., etc. Mayor Cornett, who is now much thinner, is quoted as saying the culture of the community has shifted. And now, not only is Oklahoma less fat, it's still pretty porky, but it's less fat, it's also one of the most economically successful cities in America. It has a sense of agency and self-belief. So going back to my theory, the mayor mobilized all the sources of power, the individual aspiration to be thinner, which he exemplified, business investment, community identity, corporate responsibility, and governmental oversight and action. By making a personal commitment, and of course back at that elephant cage on New Year's Eve 2007, people could simply have laughed at him, he helped to generate a city-wide sense of agency and connection. So my contention to you is that you need a bit of Oklahoma in Southampton. It's this combination of leadership, aspiration, social and corporate responsibility, fun, self-belief that Southampton, despite its great people and great strengths, needs more of. Now, this kind of mobilization isn't easy. Other places have tried to copy Oklahoma and they have failed. The idea has to be right. The moment has to be right. Key people have to get behind it and stick with it. The longest journey starts with a single step. You need a hook. Fortunately, Southampton has got a hook. Next year marks the 50th anniversary of the city receiving city status by royal charter. And so my call to arms is this: how about 50 commitments to mark 50 years? A process to honour Southampton's half-century as a chartered city in which institutions, businesses, communities in the city are challenged to make 50 commitments to be delivered by 2020 that will set the city on course for the half-century ahead. It would be something that combined my three wellsprings for action. First, aspiration and innovation. The commitments would represent your ambitions for yourselves, for your organisations, as well as for the city. Secondly, shared identity and values. You'd be in this together, building a better city for all. All the commitments will be ones that provided real public benefit and leadership. An idea like this just won't sing unless city leaders back it, manage it, and lead by example. The city leader is unfortunately thin, so he can't copy. But I'm sure you have personal habits you need to change. Now, I'm hoping that in the conversation we're having in a moment, we can explore this idea and some of the processes that might support it. It'll need two parts. An initial stage in which ideas are gleaned about the kinds of commitments people would like to see and the things that they would like to commit to themselves. Ideas big and small, substantive and symbolic, they all have places in making a kind of idea like this work. People may be as inspired by the contribution of a class in a primary school as by a multinational corporation. The process of commitment seeking and making could even start today. I'm delighted that Ian Murray, on behalf of the Southern Daily Echo, has already agreed in principle to support this idea, using the paper to engage local people, encourage them to identify and make commitments. After the initial process of ideas gathering and testing enthusiasm, the next stage is for institutions, communities and people who've made commitments to be brought together to mould a set of ideas into a concerted campaign of action. And I'm equally delighted that in principle this university has agreed to provide that kind of convening role. So what are the kinds of issues that might form the basis for citywide activity? Recurrent themes I've heard in the conversations that I've had. Skills. Here we might see commitments from schools in relation to working together to strengthen the vocational offer to pupils, from community leaders to raise aspirations from young people, from employers in relation to opportunities for work experience and apprenticeships, from colleges and employers in relation to upskilling existing workers. What about the physical environment? We heard so much that was exciting about that earlier. Here we might see commitments from landowners to open up the waterfront, from the professions involved in designing and delivering new buildings to set the quality bar higher. Let's have more great buildings. From the local authority to protect investment in public space. From communities themselves to become better and more imaginative guardians of their local environment. And on identity, those involved in promoting major Southampton events might commit to work better together so that each event adds to the overall image of the city. I was delighted that Jan Halliday from the airport has said that she'd like to see the airport doing more to excite people about Southampton when they arrive here or when they leave from here. The heritage sector, local historians, history and design academics at the university might develop a set of narratives and resources which bring the city history alive, so that anyone who lives here has more reason to be proud and anyone who visits here has more reason to be impressed. Now, in case this all sounds too speculative, pie in the sky, it's important to note some evidence that's been growing recently. And that is, it is precisely this kind of collective action, all sectors working together, and only indeed this kind of action, that is necessary to make transformative change. Citing a number of initiatives that have made a step change possible in American cities, in areas ranging from educational attainment to environmental renewal, John Canier and Mark Kramer, writing the Stanford Social Innovation Review, said this, I quote, "Substantially greater progress could be made in alleviating some of our more serious and complex social problems if non-profits, governments, businesses and the public were brought together around a common agenda to create collective impact." And they conclude, it doesn't happen often, not because it's impossible, but because it's so rarely attempted. As well as commitment and coordination as part of this process, we need acknowledgement and celebration. What about a major civic event as part of next year's 50th birthday, for which I know Kelly Canyon at Unity 101 has big ideas? As part of that celebration of the 50th birthday, what about a process whereby all those who've made commitments are invited to sign a book to be publicised and displayed prominently in the city, a book of commitments? This would be the official memorial of the city's 50th anniversary celebrations. So to conclude, I would love at this point to emulate Tony Blair, who always used to say that unless you did what he did, everything would fall apart. In fact, the only time I ever heard Tony Blair admit that he got something wrong was when he once admitted he hadn't listened to himself early enough. So rhetorically, I would love to say to you that if my idea falls flat and in a week's time no one can even remember what I said, that the roof will cave in on Southampton, that I came to warn you and you didn't listen. But the truth is this: there is no burning platform. There is no existential crisis. There is no external threat. There is just the opportunity to make so much more of what you have. Let me end with two quotes. Jeanette Winterson said, "The city we inhabit inhabits us." William Gibson said, "The future is out there, it's just not evenly distributed." Southampton's future is out there. It inhabits the city today. But right now it lies diffuse and diluted. It needs to be brought together and brought alive. It needs a catalyst. Why not make this great city's 50th anniversary that catalyst? Thank you.